to human monsters. Part 1. Alexander Pichushkin. Alexander Yurevich Pichushkin was born on April 9, 1974, in Mytishi, Moscow Oblast, Russia. Like many serial killers, he had titles. He is most commonly known as the chessboard killer, that, and the Bilsa Park maniac. Surely you would have to be a veritable antichrist, sauntering along the surface of an ocean of blood, to have earned both those dubious honorifics. I must admit, I'm guilty of having accepted 80s-era anti-Russian propaganda. I was a child after all, so my capacity for critical thinking was nearly non-existent. All I knew about the Russians was that they wore big furry hats and posed a significant nuclear threat to the United States. It was an issue elsewhere in the West because a nuclear war gives rise to a nuclear winter, and if that happens, we're all fucked. For a while there, it seemed as if the Russian threat had been eliminated. In 1991, they ceased to be the Soviet Union and became an economically desperate nation in which people lined up for free bread for hours. Years before the Ukraine conflict, the most significant incident of saber rattling in Russia was the Pussy Riot fiasco. The Russian government didn't care for gays and feminists. That's hardly ideal, but it could be much, much worse. And now it is. The Russia of 2024 differs considerably from Russia of 1974, though some things haven't changed. At the time of Alexander Pichushkin's birth, Russia was, as it is now, a nation with an incredibly grim environment, with long winters and an overabundance of functional and industrial architecture that served the local economy but contributed nothing to its culture and personality. Poverty was far too common in this nation, despite the communist Ponzi scheme that promised security to all those who were willing to cede their right to a democratic state. Indeed, Alexander and his mother Natasha lived in a one-bedroom apartment. Alexander slept on a sofa in the living room. His half-sister Katya slept in the master bedroom. Eventually, Katya would share that room with her husband, Alexander, and her son, Sergei. This living arrangement sounds awkward, but they adapted because there were no other options. Natasha's pet name for Alexander was Sasha. If it sounds strange to outsiders, it is only because there are more unisex names in Russia, and they are not looked upon as effeminate as they would be here. Alexander's father abandoned his son before Alexander's first birthday. His name remains unknown. Eventually, Natasha would sleep in the living room. Natasha worked so many hours to provide for her children that her parents provided as much assistance as they could with the children. Nobody who lived in the apartment reported any childhood abuse. Alexander was remembered as an introverted but kindly child. Russia is a place where people are hesitant to show emotion openly due to the Stalin era when you could be accused of disloyalty or worse by saying the wrong thing. You couldn't afford to be an open book. You had to keep your secrets in a safe, theoretically buried 50 feet underground. It wasn't quite the cult of personality you would encounter in North Korea, but paranoia was the prevailing mood of the nation for many decades. Needless to say, you could only win in that environment by keeping your cards soldered to your chest. Alexander was fond of collecting commemorative pins. This may come across as nerdy to Westerners, in the same league as collecting stamps. It was a common pastime for Russian children at the time, however, so he was unexceptional in that regard. Natasha described Alexander as ordinary, brave, and honest. As time would tell, none of those adjectives would serve as an apt description. A pivotal moment in Alexander's life happened during his childhood, one day at a playground. He was playing on the swings when he unexpectedly fell backwards. As he sat on the ground, the swing came back and hit him on the head. Apparently, these weren't the kinds of swings most of us were used to, for the blow to Alexander's head was injurious. Natasha was unable to afford the health care communism promised to provide to her and her fellow Russians. Eventually, he was able to walk and see straight, however. People, just like inanimate objects, can be broken. Medical specialists theorized years later that Alexander's prefrontal cortex was damaged or disabled altogether. Among its many functions is risk assessment. If your prefrontal cortex is damaged, you may struggle with anger management and other forms of impulse control. Sure enough, a change emerged in Alexander Pazushkin's temperament. The once retiring boy became short-tempered and aggressive, with many of his peers giving him a wide berth to avoid becoming a target for his predilection for violence. It was a wise choice. Years later, others would not be fortunate enough to outpace the tendrils of his wrath. Alexander's brain soon became a warehouse for rage and hatred, for in the aftermath of his recovery, he was bullied by his peers at school. They called him the Russian equivalent of retarded, because he was comparably slow-witted in contrast to his cognitive disposition before the swing set incident. Alexander would retaliate with physical violence, though it wasn't just directed at his bullies. He developed a misanthropic view of his fellow man that stained the fabric of his soul and remained as his default perspective for the rest of his life. He may have reduced the incidence of bullying, but ultimately it was just another development that set him apart from his peers at school and in his neighborhood. He built a wall in front of himself, and neither he nor anyone else could or would climb over it. Natasha became aware that Alexander was struggling at school. She tried tutoring him, but this did not yield the desired results, and so she withdrew him from grade school and enrolled him in a school for children with learning disabilities. This school didn't accomplish much in this regard except to further brand him as intellectually disabled. They were unable to diagnose him with a particular learning disability. This just led to Alexander feeling even more alienated. His grandfather suggested that Alexander move in with him, feeling that he could mentor the boy, and in doing so, steer him toward productivity. This move had a constructive effect, for Alexander had a positive role model for the first time in his life. Aware as he was that the formal schooling was of no benefit to Alexander, his grandfather's curriculum emphasized self-sufficiency. Every day after school, his grandfather brought him to Betsevsky Park, located nearby. It was a spot popular with local men. They would gather to drink vodka, talk, and play chess. This became a bonding ritual for Alexander and his grandfather. It benefited Alexander in the sense that it exposed him to a new ways of thinking and new interests to consider. As a consequence, he developed more confidence in himself. It was an inwardly directed voyage of self-discovery, and eventually, Alexander Pazushkin would find himself waiting at the end of the journey nearly unrecognizable, as he embodied hidden aspects of his character and shrouded potential that had remained dormant up until that juncture. The culture of the Soviet Union was such that it demonized the contributions and identities of individuals, which are perceived as subversive and disloyal in a communist country, where the state rules supreme to the point where it required devotion similar to that of a cult. Chess was an activity where an individual in Russia could express their individuality and excel on their own terms. The chessboard was a place where you could be somebody in a nation where you were taught that the only person who mattered was the president. Political revolution was not in the realm of possibility in a place like communist Russia, but victory could be achieved on the chessboard by the able and worthy. This proved to be one pursuit where Alexander found his niche. With practice and dedication behind him, he eventually became so accomplished he left opponents decades his senior withering in the humiliating chill of defeat. This happened by his early teens, and his frequent triumphs at the chessboard led to a significant rise in his self-esteem. At the apex of this transformation, a desire to dominate and rule over other people emerged. He was respected by others for the first time in his life, much to his relief and satisfaction. Soon, Alexander's life revolved around his visits to Bizevsky Park, where not only did Alexander play chess, but he drank a lot of vodka. Alexander was happier than he had ever been. As we all know, happiness is vulnerable to the vicissitudes of life, though for many, contentment is immune to misfortune. It was not so for Alexander Pazushkin. His grandfather suddenly passed away. He had become the most influential figure in Alexander's life, nurturing his talents and imbuing him with self-belief. His grandfather stepped up years after his father dropped the ball, and now he was gone. Everything his grandfather did for him was executed on a strictly voluntary basis. Who else would want to take on that role in his life? Unfortunately, nobody else did. Alexander would have to be self-guiding from that point onward. But how? This is a mystery that father absence leaves behind in its wake. Alexander was on his own now, with or without his mother, who was at a loss to help him become a man. Alexander moved back in with his mother. He generally kept his emotions to himself, expressing affection only to the dog his grandfather gave him. Though he had told his family he was enrolled in a vocational school, he spent most of his time at Bizevsky Park, playing chess and spending time with his dog. He also began drinking vodka more often, to the point where it became a compulsion and a dependency. He was no longer just drinking with the other men at the park. He would drink alone at home. Alcohol can do a lot of damage when you're a teenager with a damaged brain that has not completed its corporeal development. Alcohol is damaging to one's cognitive function at any age, but by drinking at that point in his life, he was a black belt in self-destruction, with himself as his only opponent. He wasn't selective about devising his drinking schedule. If he was conscious, he drank. For that matter, he wasn't deterred by the concern or condemnation of others. Alexander found something else in which to immerse himself: pornography. It's understandable, considering that young men wake up with erections and have a tendency to evaluate their female peers as sexual merchandise valuated according to one's personal preferences. Many people have blamed violence against women on pornography. They range from radical feminists to serial killer Ted Bundy. They have gotten the cart before the horse. Men objectify women as sexual objects in their minds by nature, hence the existence of pornography. Alexander's sexual prospects as a chess-playing alcoholic were likely quite slim at the time. Did this lead to sexual frustration? It's possible, for he became attracted to violent porn, most likely along the lines of BDSM. Alexander lost the last being with whom he shared an emotional bond, his dog. He would later state that he was to blame for the dog's death, though the basis for this reasoning was never revealed by him and remains unclear. Alexander held aloof from his mother and siblings for the most part. He sought solace in vodka, porn, and chess. With no positive emotional bonds in his life, bitterness and rage were free to proliferate and jaundice his view of other people. He reportedly began bringing a video camera to the park and scared children, whereupon he would document their reactions with the camera. He once dangled a child by his ankles from a window. As the child squirmed and begged for mercy, Alexander buttressed the burgeoning menace of the fearsome reputation that had become notorious among the neighborhood children by then. He accomplished this by notifying the boy that his life was in Alexander's hands. The boy survived this torture, and while he walked away with his proverbial tail between his legs, Alexander Pazushkin felt drunk, only in this instance, power displaced vodka. Even with an abuse of power at that level of intoxication, it is the victim who suffers the hangover. July 27th, 1992. Alexander Pazushkin asked a friend named Mikhail Odeshuk to go with him on what he called a killing expedition. They attended the same vocational school. That day they left school together. Alexander told Mikhail that he intended to kill somebody. When he realized he could trust Mikhail enough not to report this to someone in authority or stop him from committing the act, he invited Mikhail to accompany him. As they walked the streets of Moscow, Alexander would point out possible victims. Such people were either weak or part of the vulnerable sector. When Mikhail realized Alexander wasn't joking, he made up an excuse to go home. Alexander didn't believe that Mikhail had to go home, and he demanded that he stay. Realizing his acquaintance was not on his side, Alexander decided to make him his first victim. Before long, Mikhail's body lay on the ground in a pool of his blood. An investigation was launched with Alexander Pazushkin as a suspect. It was determined that Pazushkin was with Odechuk the entire time. That, according to the local youths. They also pointed out that Pazushkin had a quick temper and a tendency toward violent behavior. This was the evidence thus far. Alexander was interviewed and he denied everything. Many serial killers go through a cooling off period where they don't kill anyone for a while. For the next 9 years, Alexander Pazushkin didn't commit any murders. When he got home from work each day, he drank vodka, perused pornography, and followed the latest updates from the trial of Andrei Chikatilo, a man that greatly fascinated Alexander Pazushkin. Though he wished to emulate him, he also wanted to exceed his capacity to kill. He wanted a higher body count, basically. He became determined to outkill Andre Chikatilo. He planned his kills carefully. After deciding on a victim, he would choose a location where he was unlikely to be witnessed. He would also scout locations to dump the bodies. May 17, 2001. Bitsevsky Park. Evgeny Pronin was a drunk and highly skilled chess player, like Pazushkin. Pazushkin talked to him and soon realized Pronin was somebody nobody would miss. Pazushkin invited him to accompany him on a walk through the park. Alexander said it was the anniversary of his dog's death and he wanted to visit his grave. It is unknown if it truly was the anniversary of his dog's death. He would use this story with most of his victims to lure them to their deaths. When they reached the spot that Pazushkin claimed was his dog's grave, he pulled out a bottle of vodka and they soon took turns swigging. Pazushkin killed Pronin with blunt force trauma, though it is unknown what objects he used. He disposed of his corpse in a small stream. Over the following 9 weeks, Pazushkin would kill more people and lure them to a similar watery death. They were dumped down a well, which took them into the sewage system. When Alexander Pazushkin went home after each kill, he would black out a square on his chessboard. Typically, Pazushkin killed seniors and homeless people at first. Most of them did not get a concerned reaction from police. A woman named Maria Virasheva was beaten about the head and dumped down the well, but unlike Pazushkin's other victims, she survived. She climbed out of the well and went to a hospital for help. Police dropped by the hospital to take a description of the attack and the suspect. However, they did not act, and the information was not put to practical use for some time. She had no papers supporting her presence in the city. The police told her that if she left, they would not recommend a charge based on the lack of papers. Alexander lured a boy named Mikhail Lobov to Bitsevsky Park by promising to give him cigarettes and vodka. When he gave him one of each, he engaged him in small talk before striking him on the head and pushing him down the well. Lobov was the second victim who escaped the well when his jacket caught on a piece of metal. After escaping, Lobov sought out a police officer and reported the assault before describing Alexander. The officer wasn't interested. The way he saw it, Lobov was just some ne'er-do-well and not worth his time. Lobov made other attempts to get the police to take his report seriously, but still they would not consider it, feeling it was a waste of their time. Legend has it that Alexander stumbled into a police station one night while he was blackout drunk and proclaimed to the officers that he had killed between 20 and 30 people and would go on to kill more. The officers assumed it was the vodka talking and dismissed it as pure fiction. The police largely ignored what went on in the indigent neighborhoods of the country, so it was easy for someone like Alexander Pazushkin to slip through the cracks. Spring 2003, Alexander found his 32nd victim. The man was a drunk from his neighborhood. Alexander observed him closely as the man sat in the street, smoking and drinking. Alexander wanted to make sure he would be somebody nobody would miss. He approached him and found him to be hostile initially, though when he offered him vodka, the man's spirits were rendered placid. They walked into a wooded area. As the men shared the bottle of vodka, Alexander asked him if he had a wish. The man said he wanted to quit drinking. Alexander told him his drinking would end that day. He struck the man on the head with the bottle repeatedly until he caved the man's skull in. He finished him off by impaling the bottle in the open wound. He dumped the man's body in the well and departed. November 2005. Police were called to Bitsevsky Park. The dead body of Nikolai Zakharchenko was found. He was 63 years old. He had been a police officer. He was Alexander's 41st victim. The locals began to take stock of how many people had disappeared. Children were forbidden from going into the park. This was the time when the murderer came to be known as the Bitsevsky Park Maniac. The media began to shine a light on the deeds of the Bitsevsky Park Maniac, and speculation grew about his possible identity. Alexander's sister Katya began to play armchair detective in her own right. Alexander was exhilarated by all the attention his deeds were attracting. Alexander no longer shoved corpses down the well. Now he would leave them on top of snow-covered grounds or against tree trunks. He was intoxicated by the attention these acts attracted. One day a doctor was walking his dog when he came across a pack of wild dogs fighting over some bones. He soon realized the bones were torn out of human remains. Marina Moskalyeva was well aware, as everybody else in Moscow, of the Bitsevsky Park Maniac. Though it was perhaps not the safest time to walk into public parks at night with men, she did exactly that with her coworker, Alexander Pazishkin. She had left a note with her son telling him where she was going and who she would be with. She even put Pazishkin's phone number on it. Hours later, she had not returned home. Her son turned on the television and heard about a dead woman who was found in Bitsevsky Park. The boy called Alexander Pazishkin. Alexander told him he hadn't seen his mother for 2 months and that he was too busy to talk to a child. After this call, the boy called his father and told him what had happened. His father called the police. The note would become very important evidence, especially after police discovered CCTV footage of Alexander Pazishkin and Marina Moskalyeva walking away from a metro station and toward Bitsevsky Park on the date she told her son she would be with Alexander Pazishkin. 2 nights later, around midnight, police in riot gear showed up at Alexander Pazishkin's home and placed him under arrest. While Alexander was taken downtown to the police station, his bedroom was searched. The officers found the chessboard with 60 of the 64 squares colored in. During interrogation, Alexander admitted that not only did he find killing erotic, but that he often climaxed while committing homicide. His confession was aired on Russian television. At one point, he said, "For me, a life without murder is like a life without food for you." He still claimed to have killed more people than the police had assumed, insisting it was closer to between 60 and 63. He was quoted as saying, "I thought it would be unfair to forget about the other 11 people." October 24th, 2007. Alexander Pazishkin was found guilty of murdering 48 people. He was sentenced to life in prison. He is spending the first 15 years in solitary confinement for his own safety. Part 2, The Granny Killer, John Wayne Glover. The period between 1989 and 1990 was not a good time to be an elderly woman in Sydney, Australia. John Wayne Glover was born on November 26, 1932, in Wolverhampton, England. Violence was baked into his early life, what with his father having been an abusive alcoholic. His mother struggled to put food on the table amid the chaos. Young John's criminal career got off to an early start. He engaged in petty theft and committed many assaults. Despite his double life as a criminal, John Glover was remembered as handsome and charming. At the age of 15, he dropped out of school and pursued a life of crime full-time. Aside from theft and burglary, he began to run with local street gangs. He would eventually add vandalism to his resume. The police would catch up with him on occasion. That same year, he was arrested for stealing tires. He didn't help his reputation when he assaulted a police officer. In his early 20s, John served his compulsory tour of duty in the military, which included being dispatched to the Korean War. After he was discharged, he married his girlfriend, Joan, in 1955. They had 2 children. They moved to Australia in 1956. John's primary motivation was to have a fresh start. It wasn't long before John fell back into his criminal ways. In 1957, he was convicted of larceny for theft. Over the next 3 decades, he would be charged and convicted for theft, assault, and indecent exposure. Glover's sex offenses saw an uptick in 1962 when he raped 2 women, one of whom was elderly. Inflicting pain and suffering on women was the ultimate aphrodisiac for John Glover. John managed to charm the parole boards into releasing him early from hard time, and he was able to roam free, whereupon he would rape and steal some more. His urge to rape only continued to boil up inside of him. John Glover harbored a great deal of unresolved rage toward elderly women. After a few attacks, the female senior population of Sydney lived in fear. They were reluctant to venture outdoors, especially alone. It was in the mid-1980s that Glover's urge to kill could no longer be contained. It was between December 1989 and March 1990 that he carried out the murders of 6 elderly women in the greater Sydney area. Glover stated years later that he had wanted to stop killing, but something within him made it impossible for him to stop. January 11th, 1989. Margaret Todhunter was walking along Hale Road in Mosman. She was robbed by John Glover, who took her purse and money. He didn't rape and kill her, preferring instead to spend her money. However upsetting this may have been for Margaret, she was one of his luckier victims, for the attack could have been much, much worse. March 1st, 1989. 82-year-old Gwendolyn Mitchell-Hill was en route to her apartment building. Soon John Grant was on her tail. He carried a hammer with him as he stalked her. When they entered a location where he was sure there would be no witnesses, Grant attacked Gwendolyn with brute violence. May 9th, 1989. 84-year-old Lady Ashton was attacked by Glover in the foyer of her apartment building. She died from blunt force trauma. Because the murder was so similar in detail to others that had occurred in the area, the police surmised that a serial killer may have been responsible. October 18th, 1989. 86-year-old Doris Cox was attacked by Glover in a stairwell at the retirement community where she lived. She survived the assault, but due to dementia, she was unable to describe the perpetrator. November 2nd, 1989. John Glover's latest target was 78-year-old Dorothy Benke. It was a sneak attack. He was on a roll that day. He brutalized 85-year-old Margaret Pahud. He stole money from both women as they lay dying. Within 24 hours, John Glover already killed another victim. She was 81-year-old Olive Cleveland. He attacked her close to a retirement community. Not only did he beat her savagely, but he strangled her with her pantyhose. November 23rd, 1989. As 93-year-old Muriel Falconer was on the way home with her groceries, she was intercepted by John Glover. He bashed her head with a hammer repeatedly until she was unable to fight back. He strangled her with her pantyhose. He took her money before fleeing the scene. Glover avoided suspicion with his conventional appearance and disposition. A reward of $250,000 was announced as an incentive to anyone who had information about the perpetrator. March 19th, 1990. Joan Sinclair would become John Grant's final victim. A couple things distinguished her from his other victims. For one thing, she was younger, at 60 years old. The other thing was that they knew each other. They had a platonic relationship. She was unaware that he was a serial killer. By then, police suspected that John Grant was responsible for the murders, but they needed evidence to make an arrest. That day, Glover paid a visit to Joan's home at 10 a.m. Police were watching her home closely for any signs of a disturbance. At 6 p.m., police got permission to search Joan's home. They knocked on her doors, but there was no answer. They looked through the glass door and back and caught sight of a hammer residing in a pool of blood. The detectives entered Joan's home. Her head had been battered and wrapped in bloodied towels. She was naked from the waist down. Her pantyhose were wrapped around her neck. When police tracked Glover down, he was unconscious in a bathtub filled with water. He folded during questioning, confessing to all the murders. He claimed that he was so horrified by the crimes he committed that he tried to commit suicide in the bath by slashing his wrist and swallowing a gross of Valium. It turned out the reason the police suspected Glover was because one officer observed him as he behaved suspiciously in a park, i.e., he appeared to be targeting elderly women. When his home was searched, a hammer and pipe wrench were found and assumed to be his weapons. They also found several items that had belonged to his victims. June 25th, 1991. John Glover was convicted of all 6 murders. He received life sentences for each to be served consecutively without the possibility of parole. He is held in solitary confinement because of the dismay with which his fellow inmates look upon him. September 2005. John Grant committed suicide at the age of 72 by hanging himself with a bedsheet. He expressed no remorse about the murders, though oddly, he expressed some compassion for the families of the women he killed. He would not cooperate with psychiatrists and legal investigators. Part 3. The Sandman Killer. Dean Richards. Dean Ronald Richards was born on September 29, 1955, in Elizabeth South, a suburb of Adelaide, South Australia. He had 3 siblings. His father was a blue-collar worker and his mother was a homemaker back when the working class could afford such an arrangement. People always ask questions regarding serial killers, like, what fucked him up so bad that he started killing people? As far as Dean Richards goes, it had nothing to do with his upbringing. His family were not particularly dysfunctional, and they didn't suffer more hardships than any other. Evil is not a mental illness, but it can be congenital. So a bad seed has roots that usually go unseen for a protracted period of time. The only possible anomaly from his childhood is that he struggled in school. He was held back twice before throwing in the towel when he was 16 years old and dropping out. He was asocial, which dovetails with the cliché serial killer narrative about how he kept to himself and was fiercely protective of his privacy. During his adolescence, Dean began to abuse alcohol and marijuana. He made a living working in warehouses and factories as a laborer, thereby carrying the baton generationally from his father. Unlike his father, he was far from a model employee. He was lazy and frequently late, leading him to be terminated on a regular basis. It wasn't just jobs with which he found difficulty with long-term commitments. He also struggled when it came to forming intimate relationships. The combination of loneliness and isolation can lead to mental illness. Under such circumstances, one feels at variance with society. They feel like an outsider, an interloper even. This could certainly be said of Dean Richards. Richards' criminal history began in his mid-teens and ran through his mid-20s. Charges varied, with trespassing, DUI, possession of heroin, assaulting police officers, and theft. The thefts were committed to finance his drug addiction. He was constantly in and out of jail. Victim number 1, Suzanne Pohl. Suzanne Pohl was an Adelaide-based schoolgirl when hers and Richard's paths crossed in 1979. She was born in October 1964 and brought up in Salisbury North, a suburb of Adelaide. Hence, she was a minor. She was a pretty young girl with long brown hair parted in the middle and a petite figure. She was 5 foot 2 inches tall. Such a delicate creature could easily be targeted by a predator, devoid of a sense of humanity. She was very much unlike Dean Richards in that she was well-adjusted and happy, participating in sports at school, academically successful, and socially active. She had a dream to become a journalist one day. February 19th, 1979. 14 years old at the time, Suzanne told her mother she was headed out to do some shopping and would be back in a half hour. She never came back. February 20th, 1979. The naked body of Suzanne Pohl was discovered in scrubland near the Knightsbridge Hotel. The autopsy revealed that she had been raped, savagely beaten, and murdered via strangulation. Her clothes were scattered around the scene of the crime. Clumps of her hair were also discovered at the scene. As you can imagine, the murder of Suzanne Pohl sent shockwaves throughout the community. The police immediately launched an investigation spearheaded by detectives Roger Wilson and Colin Dess. Reverse engineering the case proved to be an insurmountable challenge for the men for 2 years as the case went cold. We like to think that such a task should be easy for experienced detectives, but without witnesses and clues, there were none of the proverbial breadcrumbs leading to the perpetrator's door, so there was nothing they could do at the time. May 1981. 29-year-old Colin George Manfield was found dead near Salisbury North. He had been beaten to death. Most serial killers target one gender only. Killing people of either sex is rare, though not unheard of. BTK killed both men and women. The fact that both a girl and a man were murdered indicated that it had less to do with sex and everything to do with the drive to inflict brute and deadly violence on others. December 1981. 16-year-old Deborah Joy Lamb was raped and strangled unto her death after leaving a party. It was at this point that police realized they had a serial killer on their hands. The problem was, the perpetrator left no forensic materials behind that authorities could use. Early 1982. The police formed a task force to track down the killer. They compiled a list of local offenders, which was based primarily on those who had a history of violence. Dean Richards appeared on that list. Detective Chief Inspector Joe Ayers was head of the task force. He placed a plainclothes female officer named Carmel Donnelly in a pub that Dean Richards was known to frequent. She appeared as a barmaid and she befriended Richards. Eventually, Richards came to trust Donnelly to the point where he made remarks that struck her as incriminating. March 22, 1982. Dean Richards was placed under arrest whilst drinking at the Salisbury Hotel after Carmel Donnelly cataloged a list of the statements that gave Richards away. Alcohol has a way of loosening people up, and it's not great for keeping secrets. When police searched Richards' home, they found items that had belonged to Suzanne Pohl and Deborah Lamb. Dean Richards was charged with 4 murders. The fourth was 17-year-old Mary Nielsen, who disappeared in 1978. December 1982. Dean Richards' trial began. The prosecutor designated Richards a serial killer who derived sadistic pleasure from overpowering young women and girls. Carmel Donnelly's testimony was damaging to Richards' defense. After 5 weeks in court, Dean Richards was found guilty of all 4 murders due to the surveillance operation. December 14, 1982. Dean Richards was slapped with 4 consecutive life sentences, 36 years of which would see a complete negation of parole eligibility. At no point did Richards show any remorse and continued to insist he was innocent years later. Origin of the Sandman title. Richards' victims were usually found in sand dunes or scrubland where sand was plentiful. Media coverage of the case designated him the Sandman Killer because of all the sand that was found on the bodies. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.